Good evening. Because we are going into this higher dimension of consciousness this evening, let me explain first that there are not now and never have been any teachings that may be called absolute teachings. This is just something that has never existed and doesn't even exist within the realm of possibility, so that it can't ever exist. And the reason is this: the absolute is not a teaching. It is an experience. And it is an experience that cannot be taught. It is an experience that can be imparted. There are two ways of realizing the absolute. One is an experience that some people have had of receiving the experience purely by grace, that is, without the intervention or help of a teacher. There are some in the history of the world who have come to earth very highly endowed spiritually, and they have at some time or other received the impartation of the Spirit by grace without having had a teacher, without having studied anything at all. However, the vast majority of those who have attained the realization of the absolute have attained it through a teacher. It has been imparted to them by a teacher who has attained. The teacher may have attained originally by grace, or the teacher may have attained by virtue of another teacher. I will give you some illustrations. The first of what might be called absolute revelation is accredited to Krishna. Now, of course, we have no writings, we have no manuscripts, we have no proofs of any individual by the name of Krishna, but we do have, at different periods in history, this name coming up again and again, and always in some way associated with the revelation of God as individual being, God as the only I am, and that God or I am constituting individual being. Now, we have no knowledge at all of those who attained this consciousness back in the days of which I'm speaking, but probably the first authentic record we have of such an attainment is Melchizedek. Melchizedek is about the first Probably not the first, I don't know, but so far as my memory goes at this moment, Melchizedek is about the first of whom I have knowledge of having attained the experience of the absolute. Now you will notice there is no teaching there. He taught nothing to anyone. And if he imparted this experience of the absolute, we now have no records of that. We have the record only of Melchizedek. He to whom even Abraham, the father of the Hebrews, had to pay tribute. In other words, even Abraham, founder, father of the Hebrew race, had to acknowledge one greater than himself. And that one, Melchizedek, never born, never dying. Has anyone but God never been born and never died? No, only God. Therefore, it is God, Spirit, the I Am, fully revealed as Melchizedek. In other words, Melchizedek completely in the awareness of his identity as spiritual being. Now, we have Moses. I shan't try to take them in their order, but we have Moses, who likewise on the mountaintop, that is, at the very height of spiritual revelation, receives the awareness that I am he. He knew that I am as God, but now he knows something more than that. I am that I am. I am that God. This is not a teaching. He never taught it to anyone. This is an experience. Of course, he revealed to Aaron, his brother, what had happened to him. There is no record that Aaron ever attained that demonstration or received that impartation, but Moses did. And if there were no other record, you would know that this is true. Think of this man moving from being a shepherd on the hills, in the valleys, to being the liberator of the entire Hebrew race from Pharaoh. This man Moses, who had no army, no weapons. Pharaoh, who had the greatest armies of the day. And yet, without weapons, without an army, this man walks right in and takes the Hebrews right out from under Pharaoh and is enabled to carry them across impassable desert without food, without water, without clothing, and yet bring them to this promised land. Therefore, Moses never gave the teaching of the absolute. He attained it. He gave a very relative teaching, the Ten Commandments. The best he could do with his followers was teach them to be good human beings, or try to. But to try to reveal to them that which he had attained was impossible. Now, probably, of course you know that there is a lot we do not know about Elijah, Isaiah, but Isaiah does say enough to convince me, at least, that he had attained the absolute. The fact that he says, beside me there is no other God, is enough to reveal that he attained it, not that he ever taught it. He merely revealed that he had attained it and that this is the truth. One of the next records we have is the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John reveals that John attained it. There was no record while the Master was on earth that the Master attained it in its fullness, but he certainly attained it in a high enough measure so that he could go out into the world and reveal it. But as you know, he couldn't teach it. John revealed it, but John never taught it, because it isn't a teaching. It is a demonstration. You can reveal in one way or another that you have attained it, and you can impart it, not in the full measure in which you have received it, because so far as we know, no teacher has ever had a student that attained it in the full measure of the teacher. The next we have is Shankara. And with Shankara, it becomes more of a teaching. Undoubtedly, from his writings, he attained some measure of the absolute. Not the degree that John attained, not the degree that Moses attained. Certainly not the degree of Melchizedek. But he attained enough so that he left behind him, and this is about 200 A.D., he left behind him a whole world of writings called the Advaita Vedanta, the only absolute teaching of India, the only teaching in all of India that contains absolute truth. But again, in all of India, there is, I believe, only one Advaita ashrama where those go and live who have attained it, or who have attained some measure of it. There are lots of, no, not lots, but there are a few Hindu teachers who teach from the standpoint of the absolute, but this is entirely in the realm of teaching, which is an impossibility because it can't be taught, and none of their students have ever attained it, because it is in the realm of teaching. Whenever an individual attains conscious union with God and realizes in some measure, in some degree, the I-ness of their being, of their identity, they are then in the absolute. They are then in of divine consciousness. They are divine consciousness expressing itself. Either when this happens, they decide that they are through with this particular phase of existence, and they lay down their bodies and depart and continue their life in an incorporeal form. Or they are given some specific mission on earth, and they continue to fulfill that mission until the mission is fulfilled, because the consciousness which they now are perpetuates them as long as the need remains for their earthly experience. John evidently was given the mission of preparing the manuscript, the Gospel of John, so that there might be preserved the revelation. Shankara, of course, was enabled to complete his work of preparing the Advaita of India. Jesus evidently completed his work as far as he felt it necessary to continue it. Moses took his people right to the promised land and felt that that completed his ministry. Elijah must have completed his because he ascended. He rose right out of visible manifestation without having gone through disease or accident. And so it is that each one who attains some measure of absolute realization has a work to perform. Now, part of that work is imparting this absolute to those who are able to receive it. Not all are able to receive it because it takes, first of all, an evolved consciousness. Secondly, it requires the ability to leave all, to follow the work. And you know, we speak in Scripture of leaving mother and father and sister and brother for my sake, but you haven't met many people who have done it. Nor have you met many who would be willing to if they were asked to. You haven't met many who, if you said to them, leave your nets and follow me, would actually give up their job and leave their families and follow you. But that doesn't mean that there aren't such, nor does it mean that it isn't happening, because it does happen often. But not often in the sense of multitudes, often only in the sense of individuals who, when they are called, answer. We have a question. Please explain the significance of the passage, many are called, but few are chosen. And there you have it. There are many who receive some spiritual light. And instead of instantly saying, I've got to follow this to the end, usually say, well, now, isn't that nice? My income has doubled. Or, well, I just met somebody who will make a fine companion. I think I'll get married. And so forth. In other words, they accept the increased human good and are satisfied with it, rather than to say, no, what happened? What brought this about? I must pursue this further. And so it is that many really receive some spiritual light, and aside from using it for their health or their supply or their companionship, go no further. On the whole, spiritual evolution comes about not in one lifetime. It comes about over a period of many, many, many lifetimes. And so there are those who are able in this lifetime to receive some measure of spiritual light and not go any further with it. But they have such a wonderful foundation that their next time around they really go higher. And it's possible that on the next time around, or the one after that, or the one after that, that they will keep right on until they receive the illumination of the Absolute. Now, no one by choice can attain spiritual illumination. If that were possible, again, the chances are that all the millionaires would receive it, because they could go and search out the spiritual teachers and see to it that they got all of the attention until they arrived. But you can't buy it with money. And a student is never selected by a teacher for any human reason, because they have money or because they have time or because they are a good friend. The teacher knows the consciousness of the student and the degree of readiness. The teacher leads the student on and on and on, watching, waiting for the signs that indicate that there is now a preparedness not only to receive the divine grace, but also the capacity to continue on with it. Now, let us take up these questions along with this. Please talk about the secret brotherhoods. Back in the days of 2, 3, and probably even 4000 BC, these brotherhoods existed in Egypt, and later, by means of the Greek philosophers who went to Egypt to study, the wisdom of Egypt was carried back to Greece, and from Greece across to the Holy Lands. But the great wisdom existed in India and in Egypt. In India, it remained more or less in small groups of individuals with one teacher, and did not reach the stage that it did in Egypt in large and really great wisdom schools, sometimes called wisdom schools, sometimes called mystery schools, schools of philosophy, schools of wisdom. And it was in such wisdom schools that the principles which are now embodied in Masonry existed. Every principle that is known in Masonry today existed in the wisdom schools of Egypt. As you know, mathematics came from Egypt, and mathematics is one of the foundations of Masonry. Certainly, the revelation of the nature and name of God existed in India and in Egypt. Here it was definitely known, the name and the nature of God. This never went out to the people, firstly because, you will remember, there were no books. There were very few people who could read and write. No schools such as we know them today, no printing presses, only written manuscripts that passed from hand to hand. And so all real wisdom remained among the few, and of course spiritual wisdom among even the fewer. And these naturally gravitated to the schools of wisdom. Here, the experience of initiation was begun. It could be called the experience of initiation, or in other places it was called illumination, but illumination is really the end product of the initiation work. Because initiation is by degrees. With initiation, you always start where we started this week, as human beings made up of the belief of good and evil, wholly governed by the belief of good and evil. Human beings who are partly good and partly bad, some more good than bad, some more bad than good, and some 50-50. But remember, these human beings have nothing and nobody but themselves. Anything that exists in their life exists at the standpoint of themselves or their friends or their relatives. They have no vision beyond this. Yes, beginning back in the pagan days, they began to worship God. You know why? It didn't rain that particular season, and they needed rain for their crops, and they couldn't humanly find a way to make it rain, and so somebody decided to look for a supernatural power that would bring forth what they needed, and so they invented God. Eventually, when the God didn't do all that was expected of him, they invented a second God. So they had a God for crops, and they had a God for fish, and they had a God for love, they had a God for fertility, they had a God, many gods for many different things. And in their pagan way, they prayed, "Oh God, give me." When God didn't give them, they invented new ways of coercing God. They invented tithes. We'll give God 10%, he'll give us 90%. They invented sacrifices, animal sacrifices, dove sacrifices, eventually human sacrifices. Even as late as our Hebrew prophets, they were seriously considering sacrificing their children in a fire to appease God. Now, in one form or another, this way of getting into God's good graces or getting out of God what you want has been perpetuated, so that people still sacrifice or still promise God or tithe with God or do something in order to sort of make God loosen up, be a little more generous in outpouring. But while this was going on among the illiterate, the uninstructed, somewhere among them an individual came along who made a discovery. Now, this may have been some desert traveler out under the blue skies, the great stars, the lonesome nights. It may have been a fisherman out on a little boat, toiling all night or all day, but inwardly pondering something or other. Who knows how it began, but this did happen. Somebody heard a still small voice. Somebody heard the voice say, "Be still. Be still and know that I am God." Oh, this is quite a revelation. He probably looked all around to find where that voice came from, and found himself alone. Just as Moses must have been shocked when he heard that I am, and realized it was coming from within himself. So it is then, somewhere, sometime, truth was revealed in consciousness, and probably that individual found someone with whom to companion, with whom to tabernacle, someone who had an interest in it, and eventually the two went apart, and I suppose that is how the first school began. Eventually now we come to these schools of wisdom in which gradually has been revealed the truth of being. The truth of being is this, then. As human beings, we are cut off from God. We are not under the law of God. We live by might or by power. We live principally by bread, food, drink. And the first step that is revealed to us as we go into a wisdom school is this. You are in the dark so far as truth is concerned, knowledge, wisdom. You know nothing of it. And therefore, you shall have a guide to go with you through these steps that you're going to take. And you yourself may have reliance in your guide, your instructor, your teacher. Follow where he leads. Fear nothing, because he has the key. He has the knowledge, the wisdom. Later on, this is explained to you. After you have had a while of having confidence in your guide, instructor, teacher, it is then revealed to you that what was really meant was that within you, unseen by you, within you is this teacher. Within you is the master. Within you is the light of truth. And you are to follow this light of truth which is within yourself. And it is in this way that you are first instructed that there is a God. And that this God doesn't have to be appeased. This God doesn't have to be prayed to. This God must be acknowledged as within you. One mystic saw it as closer to you than breathing, nearer than hands and feet. And so you receive your first lesson in the great truth that there is a God, then that you carry this God with you wherever you go. Paul could reveal later that neither life nor death could separate him from that God. And so it is that you begin your initiation with your attention turned to the fact that there is a God. And from there on, you learn to ponder this indwelling, presence, power, spirit. You later learn to know it by many, many names. The Buddha, the Christ, Tao. But always you learn that it is within you. You also learn its function. That even though you are in darkness, you can trust it to go before you. It is the light. You learn later that it is your food, your bread, your meat, your wine, your water, that you do not have to labor for the meat which perisheth, because you have a meat that the world knows not of. Now you know you need not labor for the meat that perisheth. You have meat that the world knows not. Only you know it. And you can't reveal it. It's not a teaching that you can go out and tell someone. You have experienced it. And because you have experienced it, you are now free of many of the worldly fears. Another thing, as you advance, you discover a great miracle. You discover that in this work, on this path, that as you go along, you become purified. Your consciousness becomes purified. If you have been accustomed to rough language, it becomes more refined. If you've been accustomed to swearing or hearing it, you get to a place where you just can't take it any longer. If you have laughed at a lot of funny, obscene jokes, you don't any longer. You find nothing funny in them. If you have enjoyed hours and hours of card playing, all of a sudden the joy is gone out of them. In other words, the world loses its attraction. Now, you haven't done anything to bring this about. You haven't studied anything to bring this about. It's not a teaching. An experience has taken place within you. This Christ or Spirit of God has begun to come alive. Your soul center has begun to be opened, and you are now finding yourself more at home with people who are spiritually minded, with books of an inspirational and spiritual nature, scripture of the world, first perhaps your own scripture. Later on you begin to find the gems that are in the scriptures of the world, other inspirational writings. In other words, you have been elevated above that human consciousness. You are now partaking of the nature of divine consciousness. Oh, you haven't yet reached the absolute, but you are living in the divine consciousness. You are partaking of its nature. You are being fed and clothed by it. You are beginning to enjoy supply without such hard labor. You are finding more ideal companionships. The activity of this spirit within you is making of you a better human, and is making of your human life a better life. Now, to most people, this is as far as they go on the spiritual path in any one lifetime, unless they have been this far on in some previous existence and are now ready to go beyond it. Because now comes the period that is described in all mystical literature of the East and of the West as dying daily. This is the experience of putting off mortality and putting on immortality. And this, of course, is an experience in depth. It's an experience that comes to but few. But when it comes, it carries you further along the path of initiation up to illumination. The difficult part of it is that now that you've gotten to be such a good human being, you have to let the whole thing go. You have to lose your goodness. Not to become bad, I assure you. You have to lose you have lost your badness, but now you lose your goodness. You may have been uncharitable, unthinking, unkind, and you have now become charitable and thoughtful and kind and generous. And now you've got to slay that. You've got to lose all of that. Now comes the difficult part of dying. It is revealed by the Master in his statement, "Why callest thou me good?" He had already died. You know, when he died, right after the 3 temptations in the wilderness, when, knowing that he was a master and could command powers, he was tempted to do it. Knowing that he had glimpsed the secrets of life and now could do many wonderful things, now comes the temptation to do it. Had he succumbed to that temptation, there would be no Christian religion today. There would be no Christian teaching, because he would have failed in the examination of his initiation. That is one of the initiation's experiences that everyone goes through on the way to the absolute. They reach the place where they are tempted to organize. They are tempted to bring in the fortune that's awaiting them if only they want to reach out for it. They are ready to accept the world's fame. That temptation comes to every single person on the spiritual path when they have reached the place where they're pretty good human beings. And now they're ready to shed their humanhood. And before they do, these temptations arise. You see, with a certain amount of illumination, it isn't difficult to gain fame. It isn't difficult to gain fortune. Many, many ways open to one who has attained some measure of spiritual light. And there's nothing wrong about name or fame that comes of its own accord. But when an individual uses the knowledge or power that has been given to him for that purpose, they're lost. And so it is that they come to a place of dying. They come to a place of renouncing any human effort to become famous or to become wealthy or to show forth great powers, to be known as a great power. There are other things, temptations along the way, because the entire humanhood must be renounced, so that it comes to an absolute point of realization that I of my own self am nothing. There is a spirit within me that doeth the works. There is a presence, there is a power. I am a beholder. I witness this invisible presence and power at work. I can watch how it goes before me to make the crooked places straight. I can see the many miracles it performs that I never could do. So it is with each person on this path that they come to that realization. Now, the question here in the development of the dedicated student toward the experience of conscious union with God, is there a period when it is essential for him to be physically present with his teacher to receive his spiritual teaching? And the answer is, of course, that unless one is one of the few to receive this grace without a human teacher, that undoubtedly there comes a time when they must be in the physical presence of the teacher. And it is said that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. And this doesn't mean when the student thinks he's ready. It has no relationship to what the student thinks. It means actually when the student is ready. How will the student know when they're ready? when the teacher appears and taps them on the shoulder. And until then, they have nothing to do but abide within themselves, perfect themselves along the line that is being revealed to them, accept whatever guidance is given to them, of which they feel a rightness, of course, and then just pray that their day of illumination will come, because as it comes, the teacher knows it before the student does. And the teacher usually is standing by waiting for the student to look up. At any rate, there comes an experience. In human life, you call it love at first sight. And that is about the nature of the experience when the teacher recognizes his student and the student recognizes the teacher. Now, is initiation always a conscious experience? That is, one that takes place during waking consciousness. It is always a conscious experience, but it does not always take place during the waking hours, because consciousness is just as much awake in the sleeping hours as in the waking hours, and sometimes more so. There are times when we are more spiritually alert when we're sleeping than when we're waking, because in our waking hours, this sense of I gets in. I, me, or mine. This sense of humanhood. And we are not always aware, we're not always hearing that still small voice or receptive. Whereas, as soon as we go to sleep and the conscious mind is resting, the mind that is concerned with I, me, and mine, the opportunity is there for divine revelation. And so it is that many of our very finest unfoldments and revelations come in sleep, not in dreaming, because we are fully awake even though we're sleeping. Fully awake, fully conscious, and yet sleeping. That is, so far as the physical senses are concerned. Now, the subject of initiation cannot be taken up in very great length in an hour, because there are so many phases and facets of it, and it goes over a period of so many years, and sometimes over a period of several lifetimes, before the full and complete revelation is given. Now, as one ascends spiritually, they learn the secrets of the human mind. Let me tell you here that there are no psychologists, psychiatrists, or schools of such that have any knowledge of the human mind. None of them have ever even suspected the truth about the human mind. They have not even reached the kindergarten stage of a knowledge of the human mind. The human mind has been revealed to those who have attained spiritual light and wisdom, initiation, but there is no one in the scientific world, the medical scientific world, who would believe a word of it, and so it is never voiced to them. Beyond all doubt, they will eventually learn about it, And the knowledge is breaking through at this very moment. The knowledge is breaking through. None of them have it, but some of them are coming to the brink of it. Because the human mind is not a power. The human mind is not a personal mind. You do not have a mind of your own, not even from a human standpoint. In other words, you haven't a mind that can become insane, because you have no different mind than everyone else has. And so if your mind could become insane, all the minds in the world would be just as insane. There is only one mind, and this is true even at the human level. And therefore, all ills must be treated not from the standpoint of you and your mind, but from the standpoint of the one mind. And this is revealed only when you are on the spiritual level looking down into the human mind. In other words, the higher you go in spiritual wisdom, the more you know about the human mind and body. Not in the sense of a doctor or a pathologist, oh no, but the human body as it is when it is separated from the carnal sense of body, the mortal sense of body. Because you see, we must have bodies, and we have, and our bodies are immortal. They are not finite and they are not material. They are spiritual and immortal. And from the level of spiritual consciousness, you can see the nature of the mind and the body of man. Now, the first revelation that you receive on the subject of mind is that mind is not a power. That is why men destroy themselves using the mind as a power. The more they use the mind as a power, the more they are destroying themselves. Because the mind isn't a power. It is an avenue of awareness. With the mind we can know, but with the mind we cannot create. Now, there are people who can use the mind to create something. They're just wrecking their mind by the misuse of the mind. Be assured of this. The mind is a most wonderful instrument. And shall I tell you something, that through the mind you have access to infinity? In other words, that which is you is consciousness. And that which is you is infinite consciousness. It is the all-knowing consciousness. It is the consciousness that embodies all of the knowledge and wisdom of the world. This consciousness which you are is that infinity. And you have access to that infinity through your mind. Just turn your mind within and let it receive. Don't use it as a power. Don't make it do something. Just turn within and let the divine consciousness which I am manifest itself through the mind to my individual awareness. In other words, back here is where I am. You remember, we found that we are not in the body. Therefore, I am somewhere not in the body, and I exist as infinite divine consciousness. I am as infinite as God, because I and my Father are one. I, the Father, and I, the Son, are one. Therefore, I am as infinite as God, but I don't have access to the infinity that I am, because I've been cut off by humanhood and taught to read a book to get knowledge, when I had it back here all of the time. There is the story, you know, of this boy who was born with great light, Nanak, and his parents were very much disturbed about him because he had no interest in the usual things of life, always kept talking about God. But when he was 7 years of age, the father decided that was enough of that nonsense. He would take him to school and have him taught. And so he took him to the schoolmaster, that is, the head of the school, and had him examined as to what grade he would go in. And after the master examined him, he said, "Why, I must be taught of this lad. He knows more than I do." And he evidently did. He also became the founder of a great religion which was wrecked by his third generation of students. It survived him, it survived the first generation, it survived the second, but the third wrecked it beautifully. Now, initiation then carries you to the awareness of this indwelling presence, the Spirit of God. It carries you to a place of relaxing, to let it perform that which is given you to do. Initiation carries you on and on and on, and purifies you to the extent that you no longer even seek God to destroy your enemies, but you're always willing to forgive your enemies. You love your enemies because you know that the only evil they're doing is through their ignorance. You can't blame one for ignorance. You are purified to the extent that you no longer wish to gain your way by any personal means of might or power. In one way after another, your life becomes purified, so that it is really a dedication to others. When this period of the dark night of the soul comes along, which is apt to last months and tear you apart, there comes the death of personal selfhood and the lifting into this higher consciousness. And in this experience, this is the revelation. You witness as if it were a tremendous light, or it may be a filmy cloud, a pillar of cloud. You witness it descending as if from above and taking form on earth as an individual. In other words, you witness God incarnating himself as man. And in this you witness, I, God, am now I, man. The Father has become the Son, and now I am. That I am. I am He. I am He that should come. And in this revelation, there exists forever after what the world calls teacher, savior, guru, but which is really that light which is God manifested as man. And the power shown forth is the power of God, which appears to others to be the power of man. And that is why so often an individual has been set up and glorified as God. In other words, it wasn't seen that it wasn't a man who was God, but that God was the man. There's quite a difference. A man is never God, but God becomes the man. Now, while it is true that there have only been a few full and complete God incarnated as man on earth, there have been very many who have appeared as God incarnated on earth in some measure, great measure, tremendous measure. Otherwise, the works they performed could not have been performed, because they were always works that a man couldn't have done. You can't ever imagine a man leaving the Gospel of John. You can't ever imagine a man leaving the Advaita Vedanta. You can't ever imagine a man leaving any of the great original teachings that were left. Now, this is the absolute, but you can see that it's not a teaching. You can see now that it is an experience. When it is given to you in words or book, it is a revelation, still not a teaching, because nobody can teach you to become it. But having been revealed to you, you can take it into your consciousness, and the very fact that you were present to hear it indicates that in some measure there was readiness to hear it. Thank you. Good evening.